They say the best way to know a person's true character is to watch how they treat someone they believe has nothing, not what they say when the cameras are on, not how they behave at Sunday dinner when everyone's performing for each other. Watch them when they think the old man across the table is just background noise. That's when you see everything. Welcome to Silver Verdict. Grab a cup of tea, settle in, and remember the people in these stories had every opportunity to choose differently. They just didn't. Drop a comment below and subscribe if you're new here. You're going to want to stay. NEMP, CMN, my name is Gerald Whitmore, and for the past 19 years I have owned Whitmore Pacific Holdings, a property development and commercial leasing group that operates quietly across the South Island and Lower North Island of New Zealand. We manage just under 200 commercial properties. We employ around 340 people directly and considerably more through our contracted firms. Last financial year, we settled 3 major developments in Christchurch, 2 in Nelson, and 1 in Wellington that, when completed, will reshape a significant portion of that waterfront. But you would never know any of that if you met me on a Tuesday morning outside my house in Motueka, in my old Swandri and the gumboots I've had since 2011, collecting the newspaper off the front step. I am 63 years old. I drive a 2009 Hilux with a dent on the rear left panel that my youngest son put there reversing out of a car park in 2018, and I have never gotten around to fixing it. I wear a watch my father gave me, a Seiko, the kind they don't make anymore, that keeps perfect time and has never once needed to be charged or connected to anything. I don't own a boat named after myself. I don't attend gala dinners. I have a vegetable garden that I tend every morning before 7, and on weekends, I play indoor bowls at the Motueka Club with a group of men whose combined wealth would surprise most people and whose combined vanity would surprise no one, because there isn't any. That is precisely how I prefer things. My daughter Sophie is 31 years old, and she is the best thing I have ever built, better than any development, any acquisition, any carefully negotiated deal. She has her mother's directness and, unfortunately, her mother's complete inability to date anyone who doesn't come preloaded with complications. When she first brought her partner home 2.5 years ago, I shook his hand at the door of my house, looked him in the eye, and thought, this man has spent his entire life being told he's exceptional. You can see it in how people like that occupy a room. Not arrogantly, exactly. More like they've simply never considered the possibility that they might not be the most important person present. His name was Dominic Prentice. 34 years old, well-presented, the kind of confident that fills silences rather than sitting comfortably inside them. He worked in commercial property finance, a senior analyst at a firm in Christchurch. Sharp instincts. Good with numbers. When Sophie told me at Christmas that things were serious, I did what any father in my position would do. I looked into him. Not intrusively. I simply made some calls, asked some quiet questions through channels I have spent 2 decades building. His professional record was solid. His reputation in the industry was good. A few people I trusted described him as ambitious but fair, which in commercial property is about as fine a compliment as you're likely to receive. So when Sophie told me in April last year that they were moving in together and that Dominic had been approached about a senior role at a new firm, I did something I had never done before in 19 years of business. I made a decision based entirely on love and something close to hope. Whitmore Pacific had been searching for a general manager of acquisitions for 4 months. The role was real, the need was genuine, and the person we needed had to have exactly the profile Dominic carried. I contacted our executive search consultancy, the same firm we had used for 3 previous senior appointments, and I asked them to include Dominic in their candidate pool without telling him where the role originated. He went through the full process. 4 rounds of interviews with our senior leadership team, a detailed case study assessment, reference checks that I did not touch. He performed exceptionally well. He earned the position on the merits of that process. He had no idea the company belonged to me. Sophie knew. I told her the evening after the board confirmed the appointment, sitting in my kitchen over a pot of tea that went cold while I explained it. She stared at me for a very long time before she spoke. "Dad," she said finally, "you do understand that this is completely mad. It's strategic." I told her. "It's mad," she said again, but she was almost smiling. "What happens when he finds out?" "He'll find out when the time is right," I said, "or when something forces it. I should have known. Even then, that something would." For 11 months, everything ran smoothly. Dominic was good at his job, genuinely good, in the way that matters, which is not the good that makes noise in meetings, but the good that shows up quietly in the numbers 3 months later. He restructured our due diligence process for commercial acquisitions and trimmed our average settlement timeline by nearly 3 weeks. He identified a leasing opportunity in Nelson that 2 of my longer-standing managers had walked past for 2 years. I found myself, more than once, listening to his reports in board meetings with the specific mild irritation of a man who is being forced to update his prior opinions in a direction he finds inconvenient. Sophie had better taste than I'd given her credit for, and I wasn't entirely ready to concede that yet. Then, on a Thursday evening in late March, Dominic called me. Not as a son-in-law. He called me the way he always did outside of work, warm, slightly careful with his words in the way younger people sometimes are with older men they're trying to respect without condescending to. "Gerald," he said. He always called me Gerald. I appreciated that. Some of Sophie's previous partners had tried mate within the first fortnight, which is its own kind of test, and they had failed it. "I'd love to have you over for dinner on Saturday," he said. "My parents are visiting from Dunedin. They've been wanting to meet you properly for a while now." Something shifted in my chest when he said that. Not a loud feeling. A quiet one. The kind that arrives when a sentence sounds ordinary but lands slightly wrong. The way a floorboard sounds before it gives. "They've been wanting to meet me?" I said. "Yeah," he said. And there was a pause that lasted just a fraction longer than it needed to. "Mum especially. You know how parents are. They want to know the family their son is marrying into." Sophie and Dominic weren't engaged. They'd been together 2.5 years and lived together for 14 months, and the word marrying had not, to my knowledge, been formally placed on the table. The way he slipped it into that sentence, smoothly and in passing, told me it was not an accident. I almost said I had other plans. My gut was offering its opinion loudly and clearly, the way it has done for 40 years of doing business. And the times I've overruled it, I've always regretted at length. But there is a version of me, the version that built something from a single commercial lease in Nelson in 1996 and turned it into what it became, that does not retreat from discomfort. That version walks toward the feeling with both hands visible and his eyes open. "Saturday works," I said. "What time?" The dinner was at their house in Redwood, a suburb north of Christchurch, in the kind of home that signals aspiration more than arrival. New furniture, good wine on the bench, the careful tidiness of a space that has been prepared for an impression. I wore a clean Swandri, not my best one, a good one, but comfortable. Dominic met me at the door and, to his genuine credit, he looked me over and didn't adjust his expression by a single degree. "You look great, Gerald." "I look like someone who found parking on Cranford Street," I said. "Which is its own achievement," he laughed. I noted that it was real. Inside, his parents were already seated in the lounge. His father, Barry Prentice, stood to shake my hand the moment I came through the door, both hands, the kind of handshake that is either completely sincere or completely strategic, and which I have learned over many years cannot be reliably distinguished by the grip alone. His mother, Pauline, touched my arm and said how wonderful it was to finally meet me. and that Sophie was an absolute treasure, which was both true and the precise thing a person rehearses before a dinner like this one. We sat. We talked. Dominic opened the wine. Barry asked about Motueka, which Sophie had apparently mentioned, and I told him I grew vegetables and played indoor bowls. He nodded the way people nod when they are listening to the words, but not to what the words are telling them about the person saying them. Pauline asked how long I had lived there and whether I had family nearby. I told her my son was in Wellington and my other son was in Auckland. She said how lovely. About 40 minutes in, somewhere between the main course and a point at which I was genuinely beginning to wonder if I had manufactured the entire feeling of unease in the preceding days, Barry Prentice reached into the breast pocket of his jacket. He produced a folded document, not an envelope this time, but a printout, several pages, folded in thirds with the kind of precision that suggests the fold was not done in haste. He set it on the coffee table between us, with the deliberateness of someone who wants the object to be noticed before it is touched. He folded his hands. Pauline picked up her wine glass. Dominic looked at his plate, and I thought, there it is. Gerald, Barry said, his voice dropping just slightly. There are some things about the history of your company, about what happened to our family that we think you should account for. I looked at the document. I looked at Barry. I looked at Dominic, who was studying the tablecloth with the focused attention of a man hoping the floor might offer him an alternative to the current moment. And I felt, in my chest, the particular cold calm that I have come to recognize as the thing that replaces panic when you've been through enough of the situations that used to produce it. I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and set it down. Barry, I said, before you walk me through that, I think there's something you should know about me. He smiled. The patient, prepared smile of a man who believes he is holding every card in the deck. I'm listening, he said. I leaned forward slightly. I never sit down to a dinner I haven't already thought about carefully. The document sat between us like something that had already been diffused. But nobody at that table except me knew that yet. If you've been with Silver Verdict for a while, you'll know we don't ask for much. But if you're enjoying this story, hitting subscribe costs you nothing and keeps these stories coming. Thank you, genuinely. I did not reach for the document immediately. That is the most important thing to understand about what followed, because the entire weight of the moment depended on who moved first. Barry Prentice had clearly spent considerable time preparing for this evening. The timing, the setting, the carefully folded pages placed just so this was choreography. And choreography only works when the other person follows the steps you've laid out for them. I had not come to dance. I took another sip of water. I set the glass down with a quiet, deliberate click. I looked at the dessert that Pauline had placed on the table earlier. A pavlova, beautifully done, the kind that takes real effort, and I thought about how much trouble they had gone to and how differently this evening was going to end than they imagined. After what I counted as a very satisfying 30 seconds of silence, I reached forward and unfolded the document. Inside were printed records, some photocopied, some screenshotted and printed, organized into sections with sticky tab dividers in 3 colors. Someone had taken real time with this. My eyes moved to the header of the first page, and my entire body went very still and very calm at exactly the same moment. The name at the top was Robert Callahan. Let me tell you about Robert Callahan. In 1998, Robert and I were partners. I was 37. He was 41. I had spent the previous 2 years building the foundation of what would become Whitmore Pacific, a small commercial leasing operation with 4 properties in Nelson. Modest but solid, growing at the rate of a business that is being built rather than inflated. Robert came to me through a mutual contact, presented himself as an experienced property developer looking to consolidate, and proposed a partnership that, on paper, made genuine sense. For 3 years, I ignored every sign that Robert was not the man he presented himself as. He was diverting fees. Not dramatically, not all at once. The way water finds its way through old grouting patient, persistent, quiet, until the damage is already done. By 2001, Robert had redirected enough in commissions and management fees, through a related entity he had not disclosed to me, to fund a competing leasing operation in Christchurch, using contacts he had built through our joint portfolio and relationships I had personally cultivated over years. When I found out, I did not make noise about it. I went quiet. I spent 5 months building a file, every transaction, every misdirected payment, every unsigned disclosure, every email, in which Robert discussed his parallel operation with an associate I later learned was his brother-in-law. When the file was complete, when it was thick enough and clean enough to end the matter definitively, I arranged to meet Robert at a cafe in Nelson, sat across from him on a Tuesday morning, and gave him 2 options. He could walk away, dissolve the related entity, assign his remaining interest in our joint properties to me, and disappear from the Nelson market permanently. Or I would take the entire file to our solicitors, and from there to wherever it needed to go, and he could spend the following years explaining himself to people who are paid to ask very difficult questions very slowly. Robert Callahan chose to walk away. I rebuilt alone. I relocated the business to Motueka, registered Whitmore Pacific Holdings as a standalone entity, and spent the next decade building it into what it became. I swore I would never again enter a business partnership without documentation that would survive any weather. What I did not know, what I had no way of knowing, was that Robert Callahan had a son, a boy who was perhaps 9 or 10 years old when all of this happened. A boy who grew up in a household where his father's business failure was explained not as the consequence of choices Robert had made, but as the result of what a man named Gerald Whitmore had done to him. A boy who heard one version of the story, repeated over years, from a man who never once acknowledged what he had actually done. That boy's name, apparently, was Barry. I looked up from the document. Barry Prentice was watching me with the contained intensity of a man who has been building toward a specific moment for a very long time. "Where did you get these?" "My father kept records," he said. "His own records. Everything you did to him, Gerald. Every pressure tactic, every ultimatum, the way you forced him out of a business he helped grow. And you've had these for how long?" "Long enough," he said. There was something underneath the steadiness of his voice that was not confidence. It was something older and more damaged than confidence. "Dad passed away 6 years ago. Prostate cancer. He died with nothing to show for 15 years of work in that industry because of what you took from him." I sat with that for a moment. I want to be honest here. I felt something. Not guilt, but something. The particular weight of understanding that a man who did the wrong thing told that story to a child, and the child believed it, and now the child is sitting across a table from you carrying 30 years of grief that was built on a lie. That is not nothing. "Barry," I said, "I'm sorry about your father. I don't need your condolences. I know. What is it you're actually after?" He leaned forward. He had clearly rehearsed this next part. His voice was measured, precise. He told me he wanted Dominic removed from his current role quietly, with a clean reference, no questions asked. He wanted a financial settlement, a figure he named without apology, paid to his family as what he called a restitution for Robert's losses, and he wanted it done before Dominic's name became attached to whatever came next before. As he put it, any of this affected Sophie's relationship with Dominic, and that is when Dominic finally looked up. I want to describe what I saw on his face in that moment, because it matters more than anything else that happened that evening. It was not the face of a co-conspirator. It was the face of a man who had been told he was attending a family dinner and had arrived to find himself inside something else entirely, and who was only now understanding the full shape of what that something else was. There was color in his neck. His eyes moved between his father and me in a rapid, clarifying way. Not the movement of a guilty person trying to track damage, but the movement of someone assembling the truth out of pieces that had been hidden from him individually. "Dominic," Barry said. A door closing. Dominic closed his mouth. Looked at the table. I watched that exchange and noted it. "How long have you known?" I asked Dominic directly. Not sharply. Directly. He looked up at me, then at his father, then back at me. He exhaled through his nose. "I knew there was history," he said. "Dad told me 2 years ago when Sophie and I got serious. He told me there was an old dispute that a man named Whitmore had forced my grandfather out of a business he'd built. He said that being close to you could be." He stopped. "Could be what?" I said. He didn't answer. His jaw was tight. "Could be useful," Barry said. "Not to fill the silence. To own it." Pauline placed her hand over mine on the table with a warmth that had been prepared in advance. I could tell by the way she deployed it, the fraction of a second's delay. "Gerald, this doesn't have to be difficult," she said. I looked at her hand on mine. I looked at her face. I looked at the smile that had been ready and waiting before I walked through their front door. "Pauline," I said, quite pleasantly, "I need you to hear what I'm about to say carefully, because here is what a man who has spent 27 years in commercial property understands about preparation. You do not walk into a room like the one I had been feeling building all week without making some calls first. Not when your gut has been speaking clearly for 7 days. Not when a name like Robert Callahan is still somewhere in the architecture of your past." I reached into the pocket of my Swandri and produced my own document. Folded simply. No colored tabs. Unremarkable to look at. "Robert's records are incomplete," I said. Which makes sense, because a man constructing a version of events for his family tends to keep only the pages that support that version. Barry's eyes moved to my document. "What I have here," I said, "are the original bank records from our joint operating account between 1999 and 2001. The withdrawal patterns, the transfer history to a related entity registered in the name of a woman who was, at the time, Robert's sister-in-law. I also have the original email correspondence printed from the archive our solicitors have held since 2002 inches, which Robert discussed his parallel operation in explicit terms with his associate, and I have a signed statutory declaration from our joint accountant at the time, a woman named Margaret Tuho, who is now 70 years old, living in Blenheim, entirely healthy, and entirely willing to confirm what she processed on Robert's instructions in the period leading up to our dissolution. The silence that landed on that table was the specific silence of a structure giving way. Barry's face had changed. The patient certainty was gone. What replaced it was something raw and, underneath the anger, something that looked almost like grief, the grief of a story you were raised on beginning to fracture. "You destroyed him," he said. His voice had lost its dinner party finish. "He made choices," I said. "And then he told you a story about those choices that let him be the victim of them instead of the author. I understand why he did that. I even understand why you believed it. But it was not true, Barry. It was not true when he told it to you. And it is not true now." Barry stood up. Not dramatically. The slow rise of a man whose legs have reached a decision before his mind caught up. "Sit down," I said, quietly, not unkindly. "Please, because what's left of this conversation is the part that actually matters, and it's got nothing to do with me or your father. It's got to do with your son." Barry sat down, and I looked at Dominic. What I saw in his face then was not what I had been watching for in that moment. I'd expected the composure he wore at work, the contained, professional steadiness I'd watched him deploy across a dozen difficult meetings over 11 months. Instead, what I saw was something younger than that, something that had not yet learned how to manage itself. He was looking at his father with the particular expression of a man in the process of understanding something he cannot ununderstand. And the understanding was doing something to him that was visible and real. "Dominic," I said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to me the way you would if I were just Gerald. Not Sophie's father, not some older man in an old Swandri, just Gerald." He nodded. "Once, small, but completely genuine." "I know who you are," I said. "I have known since before you and Sophie became serious. And what I'm about to tell you is going to reframe every single thing you think you understand about the last 14 months of your working life." Pauline made a small sound. I continued. "I told him about Whitmore Pacific Holdings. I told him who owned it and had owned it for 19 years. I told him about the executive search process, that it had been real, that his interviews had been real, that his appointment had been based on his own performance and on nothing else except that I had ensured he was in the pool. I told him about the restructure he'd done on our acquisition process, the Nelson opportunity he'd identified, the 3 weeks he'd taken off our average settlement timeline, and I told him that I had approved each of those outcomes not as his employer's employer, but as someone who had watched them happen with genuine admiration that I had been moderately annoyed to feel. I watched him while I said all of this. His face did not do what I expected it to do. It did not go through denial, then confusion, then slow comprehension in the orderly sequence you see in films. Instead, it did something more like a sudden, complete reorganization, the way a room looks different the instant the lighting changes, not piece by piece, but all at once. He sat very still. He looked at the table. He looked at me. He looked at his father. And then something shifted in his eyes that I had not been prepared for. It was cold and clear and directed entirely at Barry. "How long?" he said. The words were quiet and flat and had no performance in them at all. Barry said nothing. "Dad." Dominic's voice had an edge I had never heard from him. Not raised, sharpened. "How long have you known who Gerald was?" Barry straightened his collar. "The delay of a man who has run out of positions to fall back to." "I suspected it when you told me the company name," he said. "Whitmore Pacific. Dad had mentioned a Whitmore to me years ago. I looked into it. I confirmed it before you took the role." "Before I took the role," Dominic repeated slowly, as though he were reading the words off a page and checking them against what he knew. "So, you knew. When I came home and told you and Mum I'd been headhunted, when I was going through the interviews, when I was nervous about the presentation round and you told me I'd worked for this and I deserved it. You knew." Pauline reached for his hand. He moved it, without looking at her. "I was protecting our family," Barry said. "You used me," Dominic said. The words came out with the specific flatness of a person who has refused to let feeling finish the sentence for them. "You found out who Gerald was, and you saw a way to get to him, and you let me walk into that company and build a career there while you waited for the right moment. You used my job. You used Sophie. You used—" He stopped. He looked at the tablecloth for a long moment. I stayed completely still. What was happening across the table now had almost nothing to do with me. And I understood, with a clarity that came from 30 years of sitting in difficult rooms, that the right thing to do in this specific moment was nothing at all. Barry tried the last angle available to him. The father angle. The one that comes out when the strategic options have been exhausted. "Everything I did was for this family," he said. "Robert, your grandfather, that man took everything from him. We were owed something, Dominic. You were finally in a position to what?" Dominic's voice cracked on the word, then hardened immediately, in the way that voices do when a person decides not to let a feeling become visible. "Help you run a blackmail scheme against my girlfriend's father? Use her family to settle something that—" He looked at my document on the table, that based on what's sitting right there, Wasn't even what you said it was. Barry had no answer for that. I picked up my water glass and held it for a moment, mostly to give my hands something to do. After a long silence, Dominic turned to me. His face was composed in the way I recognized from boardrooms. Deliberate, present. The face of a person choosing to stay in the room rather than leave it. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You don't," I said. "You didn't know. I knew something was wrong about tonight," he said. "I felt it all week, and I came anyway. And I sat here while my father placed those pages on the table, and I looked at my plate. That's not." He stopped, started again. "That is not who I want to be." I looked at him for a long moment. "No," I said. "It isn't. And the fact that you know that, and can say it out loud in a room like this one, is precisely why you still have a position to come back to on Monday morning." Something moved across his face. Something that was trying very hard to be dignified about the relief it was carrying. I turned to Barry. He had his chin up. The final posture of a man who is lost and is not quite finished, pretending otherwise. "Those documents you brought tonight," I said, nodding at the folded pages still sitting on the coffee table, "are incomplete. And sitting alongside what I have put on this table, they are entirely harmless to me. I need you to understand that. Clearly, you came here tonight believing you were carrying something powerful. You were carrying a photograph of something powerful. There's a difference." Barry said nothing. His jaw was working. "I'm not going to pursue anything through legal channels," I continued. "Not because I couldn't, but because Robert was your father, and grief is not a simple thing. And I understand that a child who grows up with one version of a story is not entirely responsible for believing it. I am genuinely sorry for how he told you that story. I am sorry you spent 30 years carrying it. That is a real loss, even if the story was not what he said it was." Pauline's eyes were wet. She was looking at the Pavlova. "But I need you to hear this next part," I said, "because I will say it once, and I will say it clearly." I leaned forward. "Dominic is the general manager of acquisitions at my company. Sophie, as of her 30th birthday 14 months ago, holds a minority interest in Whitmore Pacific Holdings that will convert to a significant stake upon my retirement. Your son has built himself, through his own work, a genuine position inside something that your family spent years trying to reach through the wrong door. And the only reason any of that is still available to him, and by extension to your family, is because he just proved to me, in the last quarter of an hour, that he is not you." The silence that followed that sentence was the most valuable silence I have ever sat inside, and it cost me nothing. Barry picked up his napkin, folded it, and placed it on the table beside his plate. The gesture of a man who has nothing left to do with his hands and knows it. "We should go," he said to Pauline, quietly. Without looking at either Dominic or me, she nodded, didn't look up, stood. Barry paused at Dominic's shoulder on the way toward the door. He put his hand on it briefly. "I'll ring you," he said. Dominic looked straight ahead. "Give me some time first," he said. "Not tonight. Give me some time." The distance in those words was not anger. It was something harder to come back from than anger. It was the distance of a person recalibrating what they believe about someone they love. I know that distance. It doesn't close quickly, but it can close. Barry and Pauline Prentice walked out of their own lounge and into the Christchurch night, and I watched them go and felt nothing dramatic. Just the quiet, settled quality of something long unfinished finally being placed where it belongs. Dominic and I sat in the silence for a moment. Then he looked at me, and something in his face shifted into a register. I recognized the one I'd watched across boardroom tables for 11 months. "Gerald," he said. "Yeah, I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead." He looked me in the eye. "Do you actually trust me to do this job?" Not as Sophie's partner, not to keep things tidy in the family. As a general manager, I considered that. Because it deserved to be considered. 8 months ago, I said, you flagged a risk in the Christchurch waterfront contracts that 3 of my senior people had walked past. You didn't wait to be asked. You built the brief, took it to the board, and presented a mitigation strategy before I even knew the exposure existed. That saved us from a very uncomfortable conversation 12 months down the line. I paused. Yes, I trust you. He was quiet for a moment. But, I added, he looked up. Monday morning, you and I are going to have a proper conversation. Not owner and GM. Not father-in-law and son-in-law. 2 people. Honest, direct. No more gaps. No more flannel shirt mystery, as Sophie would put it. The corner of his mouth moved. Speaking of which, he said, is the Swandri a permanent fixture, or can we establish some kind of formal occasion guideline? The Swandri, I said firmly, is non-negotiable. He laughed. A real one. The first genuinely real thing I'd heard from him all evening. And it was, I noticed, a very good laugh. Pauline's pavlova was still on the table. It seemed a shame to leave it. That looks like it took effort, I said. He looked at it. She was up at 6, making it. We ate the pavlova. The cream was very good. I made a note to say so the next time I saw Pauline. Because a woman who makes a pavlova from scratch at 6 in the morning, even for the wrong reasons, deserves to hear that her pavlova was excellent. I drove back to Motueka in the Hilux. The Canterbury Plains were dark and wide on either side of the road north. And the sky was clear in the way that South Island skies are clear when the nor'wester has passed. Not dark, exactly, but deep. The kind of sky that makes the world feel appropriately sized. I thought about Robert Callahan, the young man he had been in 1998 before the choices he made became the shape of his life. I thought about Barry sitting somewhere in Redwood tonight with 30 years of story he would now have to take apart and rebuild from different materials. I thought about Dominic driving somewhere, perhaps parked, perhaps walking, working out how to carry what he now knew about his father, alongside what he still felt about him, because those 2 things do not cancel each other out, however much we might wish they did. I thought about Sophie, who would be getting a phone call from Dominic tonight, and who would ring me tomorrow morning before I'd finished my first cup of tea, and who would say something precise and slightly exasperated and completely right, as she usually does. And I thought about what it means to build something over a long time. Not just a company, not just a portfolio of properties across 2 islands. A way of moving through the world that means when someone finally comes for you, and someone always eventually does, you are not scrambling at the table. You are already home. I pulled into my driveway in Motueka just before 11. Sat in the Hilux for a minute with the engine off. Looked at my house, modest, warm, the kitchen light on because Sophie had dropped by earlier in the week and she never turns it off, a habit she inherited from her mother and which I have stopped trying to address. My phone buzzed. A text from Dominic. Told Sophie everything. She says you're completely impossible and she loves you. Also, she says, the Swandri is an embarrassment and she's on my side. I sat in the dark of my driveway and smiled at that. I typed back, tell her, the Swandri built her inheritance. I put the phone in the pocket of that same Swandri, got out of the Hilux, and walked up to my front door. Somewhere south of me, Barry Prentice was sitting with an incomplete story and the first real knowledge that it had holes in it. That is not nothing. Sometimes the beginning of truth is just the moment a person stops being certain. And I was going home to my vegetable garden. There is something worth sitting with at the end of a story like this. Wealth, real wealth, is not the thing that makes people treat you well. It is the absence of it that shows you who they actually are. The people who were kind to me in the flannel shirt and the old Hilux, those were the people worth knowing. The ones who looked through me when they thought I had nothing were simply showing me their own ledger. The other thing is this. A lie told to a child to protect a parent's pride is one of the most expensive gifts a parent can give. Robert Callahan did not give his son the truth. He gave him a grievance, and that grievance cost Barry 30 years and nearly cost him his son. The most honest thing a parent can do is show their children not just who they want to be, but who they actually are. Because children are going to find out eventually, and it is better they find out from you. And for the young people in a situation like Dominic's, your integrity belongs to you, not to your family's history, not to someone else's unfinished business. You walked into a room with someone else's agenda tonight. You walked out with your own. That is the only inheritance worth having. Some men build things to prove something. I built mine to protect something. There is a difference, and it is worth knowing what that difference is before you start.